morning, everyone. My name is Qing Gao. I'm the director of the China Center for Social Policy at Columbia University, also a faculty member at the Weatherhead East Asian Institute at Columbia University. Welcome, everyone. I see some old friends, some new friends joining us from around the world. It's really my pleasure to welcome everyone in this very beautiful, breezy autumn morning in New York. We had some heavy rain last night, but today it's beautiful and sunny. This year, we have our lecture series focusing on an important and timely theme, COVID-19's impacts and responses in China and beyond. Today's lecture is very special. It's also our annual lecture this year, featuring two of my great mentors and one collaborator. So I'm especially honored and happy to host this event. Today's lecture will focus on China's COVID-19 responses and the state of local finance in the era of Xi Jinping. Our presenter is Professor Christine Wong, who is currently a visiting research professor at the East Asian Institute at National University of Singapore, and also a visiting chair professor and the Schwarzman Scholars Program in Tsinghua University. Professor Wong is probably the most renowned scholar currently studying public finance in China. She has been doing this for the past 3 decades, publishing widely in governance, economics, development, and welfare. Previously, she was the professor of Chinese studies and director of the Center for Contemporary Chinese Studies at the University of Melbourne. And then before that, she was professor of Chinese public finance and director of Chinese studies at the University of Oxford, and the Henry Jackson Professor of International Studies at the University of Washington. Professor Wong has held senior positions in the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and worked with many international organizations and offered her expertise to many governments, including central and local government in China. Our commentator today is Professor Carl Riskin, who is a senior research scholar and adjunct professor of economics at the Columbia University Weatherhead East Asian Institute and distinguished professor at CUNY Queens College. Professor Riskin has been researching the complexity and changing nature of the economic development in China for many years. In 1987, he published the seminal book, China's Political Economy, The Quest for Development, since 1948, which has been guiding the field of studying Chinese economy for the many years since. He has been authoring many more books in recent years, including Inequality and Poverty in China in the Age of Globalization and China's Retreat from Equality, that's published in 2001. He has been a major leader in the China Household Income Project survey data collection, and that's how I got to know him, first as a mentor and then later as a collaborator. So this is a joyful and meaningful reunion for the three of us. First, we will have Professor Wong to give a lecture, and then Professor Riskin will offer his commentary. I invite the audience members to please enter any questions you have into the Q&A box, and after their presentations, we will address your questions. Thank you very much. Professor Wong, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Jin. It's a great pleasure for me to come to New York, to do this seminar. I wish I were in New York. I was in New York 4 years ago, speaking in your seminar series. I hope I'll be able to come again, maybe next year. Although today in Singapore, we've just entered a backward step in more restrictions on movement again, as we try to exit this pandemic. But anyway, let me get started because I want to leave plenty of time to hear Carl's comments. Carl is an old friend and 老同学, and I followed him in Berkeley, and I looked up to his work in rural industry in the early days, and of course his book on political economy of People's Republic of China, right? or the Chinese economy was a textbook that I used for many years in teaching. So let me get started. And I'm going to share a PowerPoint. Sorry, let me get there. Can you see that? Okay. This is work that combines several papers that I've written recently on China's COVID response and also on China's central local public finance through the various decades. Now, actually, China, in many respects, China has handled the COVID pandemic extraordinarily well. After a brief and draconian lockdown, the economy reopened from second quarter on, and actually China became the only major economy in the world last year to achieve positive economic growth. And you can see from this graph that I took from Wall Street Journal, I think this very dramatic decline in GDP in the first quarter of 2020. So Wuhan shut down on January 23rd, and many cities in China followed quickly, and then the lockdown spread through much of the country, and economic activity came to a standstill in many places. And the economy contracted by 6.8% in the first quarter. And then the country gradually started to reopen in late March, early April. And so April, May, June, slowly reopening. And China is basically open nowadays, except for places where there are some scattered outbreaks of COVID. And so China is the first country to really return to more normal operations. And you can see that it ended 2020 with a 2.3% growth in the GDP. Consumption always lagged behind. So the recovery, economic recovery was led by manufacturing, exports, and infrastructure. And consumption lagged because household income was hit very hard. As during the height of the lockdown in February and March, estimates were that as many as 130 million people were idled, whether they were out of a job or whether they were just furloughed from their jobs. Of course, job losses were worldwide and remain in many places below quite significant, job losses quite significant around the world. At the height of the pandemic in mid-year 2020, the ILO, International Labor Organization, estimated that 495 million full-time equivalent jobs were lost. And governments around the world responded to this pandemic with unprecedented fiscal injections. In many rich countries, governments spent upwards of 20% of GDP or more on various stimulus measures that included providing liquidity support to enterprises, bailouts of strategic sectors, airlines in particular, but also very substantial efforts were put into keeping people in jobs and helping those who were unemployed under the argument that it's necessary to keep people in jobs and keep people fed and housed and smooth out consumption in order to keep businesses alive. Because once the businesses collapse, it's much harder for economies to recover. The IMF in a June 2020 report estimated that globally, 30% of fiscal initiatives that were implemented by countries around the world up and down the income spectrum, rich and poor countries, cash transfers were 30% of the fiscal initiatives. China was quite different. So in contrast to all the other countries, China's response was relatively modest. And it's relative in terms of, compared to other countries in the world, but also compared to its own history. In the global financial crisis in 2008, China came out with a huge fiscal stimulus package that was 15% of GDP, when everybody else was much more modest. I think the Obama stimulus was 9% of GDP, although he wanted it to be bigger, but China was by far the biggest in the world. The other difference was that in China, the fiscal stimulus went and almost entirely to supporting businesses. And this was surprising to me as I was watching what was happening in China last year, because in April, in the buildup toward the delayed National People's Congress, which was held in May, there was a lot of talk about concern of unemployment, people's hardship. In the April Politburo meeting, the press release mentioned employment, only slightly less than it mentioned epidemic. So one of my colleagues who did these word clouds found that employment was the second most frequent word that appeared in the official discourse, just behind epidemic. But when the fiscal stimulus, or when the budget report was published, there was not a cent put into people's hands in social welfare programs. And Premier Li Keqiang explained in the press conference after the NPC that yes, employment is the topmost concern, and the measures taken are to stabilize the enterprises to keep the jobs secure. So the argument in China is the opposite of what other countries were saying, and that they insist that it is the keeping enterprises healthy and alive was the best way to keep jobs secure. This is the some of the fiscal measures that were introduced. 7 trillion yuan in a package. That these measures are almost all going to supporting enterprises. There was some discussion in the press about whether a cash handout was necessary in China, but it was largely ruled out because the idea was that in China, the disruption was temporary, short-term, and people would be back to working very soon. And that in fact, there are existing social welfare institutions that were able and could take up the burden of helping people. In April, Premier, again, Li Keqiang, called for government agencies to expand coverage of the unemployment insurance and social assistance programs to provide support for those suffering economic hardship. And he emphasized the idea of core you should just expand and extend coverage, stretch the program to try to cover as many people as possible. And he said, for people who don't qualify for unemployment insurance, they should be covered under the social assistance programs, DBAO. The Deputy Minister of Civil Affairs in a press conference in May emphasized the same thing. He promised to strive to ensure that social assistance programs will not miss one household or leave one person behind. This is a quote from the official English translation of the press conference minutes. And he talked about 应保尽保, 凡困必帮, 有难必救. We're not going to leave anyone behind. We have programs that can cover everybody in need. So how did the system work? I have two pictures to show. First, the unemployment insurance, which is the big program that covered 205 million people enrolled in 2019. The orange line is the number of people receiving unemployment benefits. And this is the long-term graph. They only provide annual data. You see on the, at the end of 2019, there were 2,280,000 people receiving unemployment benefits. At the end of 2020, after this cataclysmic year, the number of unemployment insurance beneficiaries increased by 420,000. At the end of March, the Minister of used to be called Labor, it's the Human Resources and Social Security Ministry. He said there were, at the end of March, 2.3 million people on unemployment benefits. That's an increase, if you do the math, of 20,000 people through this horrible quarter. The blue line is the number of registered unemployed. Everybody knows that this is a very flawed measure that's quite narrow, where it only counts people who come to register for unemployment, and it's limited to urban hukou residents. So migrants who are working in the cities, losing their job, cannot register here. And that number increased by 2 million, a little more than 2 million. But even compared to this blue line, the response of the orange line is quite anemic, right? Even though we're grossly undercounting unemployment. The benefits are very low in the unemployment insurance program. It's far below replacement level. In most OECD countries, unemployment covers 40 to 60% roughly of your wage. So it's a 40 to 60% replacement of your lost wage if you're unemployed. And it varies by your wage level. In China, this is a flat benefit by city, and it's set by the city average wage. And it averaged about 19% in 2019. And it also discriminates against migrant workers. Even if they join the unemployment insurance pool, they don't get the monthly benefit. They get a lump sum equal to 1 month per year of contribution, up to 12 months. And I'm not sure if they're counted in the 2.7 million. Okay. Moving quickly to the social assistance programs administered by the Ministry of Civil Affairs. It's kind of a pretty picture that shows very little change from second quarter of 2019 to fourth quarter of 2020. So the blue bar, the first one, is urban debao in millions. And the orange bar is rural debao. So these are the big programs. And then you have the relief for the extreme poor. This is my own translation, so it probably doesn't match up to Gao Qin's translations, and I apologize. This is the CUNY component. And then you have the temporary assistance component that's designed for disaster relief, people who fall into temporary hardship. And then there's a new category called assistance for homeless and beggars. Nothing much happened here with that component in 2020. And if you look at debao from fourth quarter of 2019, urban debao was 8.6 million. This number fell throughout 2020 to only 8.05 million by the end of the year. Rural debao, nothing much happened in quarter one and slowly increased a little bit. And by the end of the year, it had increased to 36.2 million. So when you add up urban and rural debao, the net increase is only about 1 million people. You have 1.5 million, 1.6 million increase in rural dibao, offset by 500,000 decrease in urban dibao. But in any case, no matter how you look at it, dibao didn't really respond very robustly to the hardships of all these migrants who lost their work, their jobs, and went back to the countryside. The only component that showed any real change is a temporary assistance component. And you would expect that because the pandemic is really kind of a temporary disaster. So it should fall under this category. But you can see that from Q1 2020, it increased very slowly in Q2. Again, slow increase in Q3. And it's really only in Q4 that you begin to see a bigger jump. And so by end of the year, 13.4 million. These are 人次, it's a million person times. So you have an increase of about 11 million people receiving temporary assistance. So what is temporary assistance? We know dibao has these thresholds and monthly amounts that are well established. Temporary assistance is kind of whatever the city can afford. And in some places I read that temporary assistance means 40 yuan. For whole provinces, the average comes to 50 or 60 yuan per person time. Okay, so if you look at aggregate numbers of spending, there's not much increase here. So many causes, there are many causes of the weak social welfare response in total. Design, administration issues. I think, Gao Qin and many other people in the audience know more about these social welfare programs than I do. I'm going to argue that a big reason there's such weak response is because of inadequate fiscal resources at the local level. And I'm going to now pivot to talk about the fiscal system to explain why I make that argument. But before I go there, I want to just note a feature of the social welfare system, and that these are national programs in the sense that the central government sets the policies and the basic design of the program, but they are implemented and administered by local governments. Unemployment insurance is run at the city level. It's funded by contributions from employers and employees, and reserves are managed by the used to be the Labor Bureau, now the Human Resources and Social Security Bureau at the city level. And it has huge reserves. As you can see, they pay out very little, and therefore they receive no subsidies from government. The social assistance programs are run at the county or district level and receive subsidies from higher level governments, but on an ad hoc basis. There's no set formula for how much the higher level governments would contribute, and there's no fixed cost sharing. It's just ad hoc subsidies. In 2020, I see that it was roughly 60%, 62% of the total was paid by central government. I almost always start my fiscal talks with this pictorial history of China's transition in public finance. You see this big U-shaped curve where in the first 20 years of the transition from 1978, you have a collapse of government revenues from 32% of GDP all the way down to touching 10% of GDP at the bottom. And this was caused by the dismantling of planned mechanisms that had propped up state-owned enterprise profits, which went into government coffers. And when reforms began to erode SOE profits, government revenues went south rapidly. I think it's useful to talk about this fiscal history and the changes, evolution in fiscal policy in the more recent 3 decades. And these they fall into 3 administrations. You have the Zhurongji period from 92 to 2002, the Hu Jintao Wen Jiabao period, 2002, 2012, and then we have the Xi Jinping era here. In each era, the leaders respond to the problems of the preceding decade. Okay, so Zhurongji was responding to fiscal decline and how to fix that. So he focused on pushing through the tax sharing system reform and fixing the SOE problem so that they would stop bleeding government resources. The next period, Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao were reacting to the problems of a collapse of public services as government was running out of money and a collapse of transfers to help poor regions. So rising inequality across regions and sectors. And those are the problems that they aim to fix. And in the Xi Jinping period, the main problems are to fix the administrative problems and accountability issues of the rapid ramp up of spending during the previous decade. So let me explain these in more detail. But I'm going to, because the previous decades have been very well covered in the literature, I'm going to talk about the most recent 2 decades from 2000 on. The resurgence of government in the 2000s. So the tax sharing system reforms succeeded spectacularly in reviving revenues and reversing the fiscal decline. So revenues climbed back up to 22% of GDP by 2012. But actually, this understates the amount of resurgence and the ramp up of spending and revenue flows because the GDP was growing so fast during that period. So the denominator in the previous figure was growing very rapidly, right? So budget revenues grew at 22% per annum from 1.3 trillion to 11.7 trillion from 2000 to 2012. These growing revenues allow for robust expansion of government. So you have expenditures growing at 21% per annum, which allowed for increased spending on social services and huge investment in infrastructure. And we know that under Hu Jintao Wen Jiabao, the development paradigm shifted to embrace inclusiveness, inclusive growth, building the harmonious society, and so on. So many new programs were introduced, starting with the rural sector, improving. I think actually this is understudied, the amount of change that happened in the rural sector, because with the abolishing rural fees and agricultural taxes, Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, within a few years, changed the rural sector from being largely outside of the state coverage to be from being a self-sufficient, largely self-sufficient sector that had to depend on its own resources to fund services to one where the services now are funded by government, just as they are in the urban sector. So these are some of the programs that were introduced to extend rural public services to the rural sector, including medical insurance, free education, upgrading schools and dormitories. If you travel to the countryside, if you've traveled in the last 2 decades to the countryside, you can see new schools, new dormitories being built everywhere, new clinics, hospitals, et cetera, et cetera. You have the minimum, you have the social safety nets being extended both to the rural sector, but also within the urban sector to those people who were not previously covered, who were not part of a danwei, who were not part of the state sector, and so on. So this is quite a remarkable decade of expansion of social services and social safety net. Now, in embracing the rural sector, the government took on some very big and very costly programs. You can see the number of beneficiaries are just enormous for the compulsory education, health insurance. You have the Dibao program that covered almost 54 million people at the peak. You have the rural pension scheme that covers everyone, etc. So this period saw huge improvements. I'm going to have to speed up. With education and health expenditures growing at 22% per annum in constant prices during this period, a really remarkable record. And so you have much improved access and improved services. And China built the framework for a comprehensive social welfare system during this period. And also, it was during this period that you have greater central government funding and central government design, a top-down design of programs that brought greater uniformity in service standards, but also timelines for implementation. But the costs fell mostly on local governments. You see here, the red line is the share of all local governments, subnational expenditure as a percentage of total budget. It went from 65% to 85% during this period. And the revenue share of local governments changed a little bit, but not nearly enough to offset the increase. More interestingly, the 20% increase here, 65 to 80% of the subnational sector went almost entirely to the county level. So this is a graph here that shows the county share of the national budget expenditure, going from 26% in 2000 to 45% in 2012. Okay, while the central government share fell from 35 to 15% during this period. This means that even though the revenue sharing rules had not changed, the intergovernmental fiscal balances had been significantly changed through the Huwen period. This is basically the same information, but I've included the revenue proportions, the revenue shares of the four levels of government here. And you can see that all levels of subnational government faced fiscal shortfalls, but by far the biggest gap is at the county level, where they spent 46.3% of the budget, but earned only 26.5% of revenues. So the government chose to finance the new programs, the new spending through transfers. This is a picture of transfers. The blue bar is the size of transfers in billion RMB. That's on the left-hand axis. And it went from 254 billion to 4 trillion yuan during this period. The red line is the share of central revenues that were turned over to transfers. And that rose from 36% in 2000 to 70%, a bit more than 70% in 2012. As the central government vowed to end unfunded mandates that had been such a problem in the 1990s. During this period, transfers went from funding 16% of all local government expenditures to funding almost 60% of it by the end of the period. And they were taking up an increasing share of central government revenues. This is the Hu Jintao Wen Jiabao period. As the reliance on transfers grew, administrative burdens multiplied. And you can see this clearly through the mechanism through which transfers reach spending units. And it's quite a remarkable picture, actually. Transfers go from central government to 36 provincial and semi-provincial units. So 31 provincial units plus 5 deputy province cities, right? And then the money is turned over from each of these units to their subordinate municipalities and prefectures, and again, downward to the counties, and then to the spending units. At each level, if you remember that each of these subnational levels face fiscal gaps of their own, the decision is how much is kept at that level to fund its own needs and how much is passed on to the next level, and so on. So this process is very time consuming and it's unpredictable because each unit, each provincial unit, each municipal has some discretion on how much to pass on. So before I get you come here, I want to emphasize that during the Huwen period, with these huge programs coming online, numerous programs coming online that caused the number of transfers to proliferate because every program came with funding and it would be typically earmarked. So from the central government goes to the Ministry of Education for education, and the Ministry of Education breaks it up into different components of education and passes it on downward. And at each level, the government can add more earmarking and more programs to the mix. So by the time it comes to the county level, they were just coping with hundreds of earmarked transfer programs. And you have these new programs that were being introduced very rapidly through, especially 2006 to 2012 period. And accountability was very difficult to maintain. And there was a lot of waste and corruption that developed with these programs, which in many ways marred the achievements of this period in improving services. And this is the program or the problem that the Xi Jinping administration inherited and aimed to fix. And this is, they came into office with grand ambitions of reform. You have a comprehensive reform program in the fiscal system announced in early 2014, with first phase focusing on fixing the public financial management system to rein in extra budgetary resources, local government borrowing, improving transparency, strengthening accountability, etc. And then this would be followed with a tax reform, part of which is to create some new revenue sources, property tax, resource taxes, and so on, for local governments. And then they would get ready for intergovernmental reform, where the government promised a realignment of spending and revenues across levels of government. Okay. I think last time I was at Columbia in 2017, I talked about these budget and public financial management reforms, and they have been continuing, and great progress has been made in creating these systems of accounting and reporting. There's much better reporting of local government budgets, much more transparent, and they've created local government borrowing mechanisms and so on. And so there are lots of mechanisms and institutions that are now in place that were not there before to enable stronger top-down control and enforcement, which creates the preconditions for intergovernmental reform. But here, reforms have stagnated. The central government has not followed through in altering the revenue sharing or reducing burdens of local governments. The promise was actually never really to share more revenues, but to take up some of the expenditures to increase central government spending relative to local spending. But that has not changed. It's stuck at 1585 central local. There's been little progress in creating new local revenue sources. And instead, you have tax cuts that come in cutting local government revenues. There's no property tax, and resource taxes are still lagging. And so you have local governments still very dependent on land revenues and real estate development. You have problems of local government borrowing that continues. And in fact, the uneven pace of reform has exacerbated local fiscal stress. Budgeting has tightened up to eliminate slack in the system. Treasury management is much improved so that the Ministry of Finance now can monitor cash balances at the local government level. And borrowing is now tightly controlled. There's also a policy switch, pivot, where the central government is less accommodating than the Huan administration. So this is a picture of transfers as a share of central revenues. The blue bar is the central government share of revenues turned over to transfers. And as I mentioned, the Huan period central government was willing to turn over a rising share of its own revenues to help local governments fund their expenditures. This seems to have changed. From 2013 onward, 2012 onward, the central government share of revenues turned to transfers is roughly constant at 70%. This seems to be a policy target, is to hold transfers at roughly 70% of central government revenues, whereas before they were willing to up that percentage before. And in the absence of new revenues for local governments, the dependence of local governments on transfers has fallen. So that's the orange line. The transfer dependency is the transfer divided by local expenditures. The share of local expenditures that's financed by transfers has fallen from a high of 39% in 2009 to 31%, roughly 31%, I think. Okay. To be fair, this is a time of consolidation after a decade of very rapid growth in spending, with annual growth of 20 and 22% in education and health and other programs. Local governments actually, in many cases, were unable to keep up with the new programs and the new spending. And audit reports are finding lots and lots of local government accounts stuffed full of money that they were unable to spend. And partly that's because transfers come so late in the year. But this is a period when the Ministry of Finance basically says, spend what you've got before asking for more. And so you have a tightening of policy at the top. Macro trends have also turned downward. You have the end of fiscal expansion, you have slowdown of revenue growth driven by slower GDP growth in this third decade, plus tax cuts that has brought the share of revenues in GDP down to 19%. Since 2015, there have been a series of tax cuts that have really brought down revenues. And these have hurt local revenues more than central revenues. You can see that in this table. I want to speed up, so I'm going to just point out in the sub-period 2015 to 2019, you have GDP growth continuing to slow, but revenue growth lower than GDP growth, and local revenue growth slower than overall revenue growth. But expenditure pressures keep growing because you have many top-down directives, central government programs that are continuing to roll out. For DBAO, for just one example, in 2016, the DBAO program was ordered to link up with the poverty program, which makes sense, but it required DBAO to merge the DBAO thresholds to the national poverty line. Now, prior to this change, DBAO was set by the local county level based on partly on need and partly on what they could afford from their budgets. From this point on, though, from the link up, this becomes a national program and everybody must catch up. And you can see what it means for some of these poverty counties in the poorer provinces. You have the poverty counties in Guangxi having to raise their DBAO thresholds very quickly to catch up to this mandate. Okay. And there are the DBAO is just one program. There are many other programs in education, health, pensions, etc. And I want to go through this little thought experiment on county fiscal status. Remember, most of the new spending falls on county budgets. Okay, what happens? Well, we have data on the county share of the budget published by the Ministry of Finance in these nice compendia of local finance yearbooks up until 2009, and then they stopped publishing them. But after that, we could, through some sleuthing, I could find data up to 2016 in the fiscal yearbooks. And after that, I haven't been able to find anything. But these are the shares of county expenditure and county revenue of the national total. Okay, it seems to have stabilized from 2013 onward. So I thought, let's project forward based on the 2016 shares to see what happens here. So the blue bar is the fiscal gap at the county level. That's taking the share of its revenues and subtracting its share of expenditures to derive the gap. And that's grown as expected. And then compare that to total central government transfers to local governments. And you can see that in the earlier years, counties took up roughly 70% of total transfers. It rose to 80% and then gradually to 97% in 2019, if the counties were able to keep their share at 46% of expenditure, which is extremely unlikely because the counties are at the bottom of the revenue sharing hierarchy, and the intermediate levels of subnational government have expenditure needs as well, and they have fiscal gaps to fill. And so they cannot possibly be passing on all the transfers to the county level, which leads me to think that a gap is likely developing between mandated expenditures for counties and actual expenditures. And if that's true, here's what we find. At the macro level, macro data show that budgetary spending on education, health, social security, and housing, they were growing rapidly in the early 2010s, and they stopped growing and started to decline as percent of GDP. Okay, and then if I looked at education spending as a share of GDP, basically the same picture, but the decline occurred a little bit earlier, and then a little bit of a rise and then down again. This is taking the 2021 budget through the first 8 months And if the current rate of spending holds, China is going to fall to 3.2% of GDP in education spending by the end of 2021. Okay, this is a reminder that local finance is critical for achieving national goals. I'm going to wrap up. So COVID-19 should be a wake-up call to fix China's social welfare system because it was unable to respond to the emergency. And the State Council noticed that and issued a directive calling for reforming and improving these programs to build a tiered and classified social assistance program. So I look forward to seeing what that means and how it's going to happen. But fixing the social welfare system requires also fixing the intergovernmental fiscal system to ensure that local governments have adequate financing to perform their assigned roles. And the urgency goes beyond social welfare because the COVID is largely behind China, but social services need to be, they need to continue to grow. Countries around the world face unrelenting pressures to increase spending on health and pension programs over time. And these pressures are growing rapidly because China's aging very rapidly. So let me end there. And I will stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Christine. Very profound, and I have many thoughts, but next, Professor Riskin will offer commentary. Please, Hao. Hao, please unmute yourself. Thanks.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. It is really a pleasure to comment on a talk by Christine. This is not the first time I've done so, and I hope it won't be the last. But her talks are always so complete and informative and data-driven that it kind of leaves one with very little to add at the end. So I am going to make just a few comments, four, I think, some of which are questions. And they are, number one, it's easy to overlook the achievements of China's fiscal system because there are so many faults and failures that remain. And it's important to keep the view balanced, which I think Christine really did in this presentation very well. Secondly, a question, why do social welfare programs in some respects seem to be the exception to the rule of extremely rapid development of new institutions in China after they are inaugurated? Thirdly, another question, and these are rather naive questions. Chin has to alter her very generous introduction of me by adding the word emeritus in front of everything she said, because I'm now retired and no longer hold those titles. So I get a certain freedom to ask naive questions. So third, another question, this one about whether a relative lack of access to individual income information might be a factor in explaining the nature of social welfare policies, especially in a crisis like the COVID pandemic. And finally, the question of Dibao and its suitability for expansion to handle crises like the pandemic. So first, the achievements. Let me start that with bringing up the topic of human development, which I assume most people in this audience will be familiar with, improvements in what Amartya Sen calls the fundamental capabilities of people, that human development is very much a combined product of economic growth and how that growth is used to bring about improvements in people's lives, especially those of the rural populations and others at the low end of the income distribution. The how that growth is used question depends greatly on the fiscal system, which determines how much fiscal dividend there is, that is, how much expansion in fiscal revenue occurs for a given amount of economic growth, and how much of that fiscal dividend goes to finance education, healthcare, poverty alleviation, access to clean water, and other human development enhancing goals. That is one important reason why the work that Christine has been doing for so long on central local fiscal relations is so vital, because it delves into precisely the mechanisms that determine how and how much spending on social welfare is done and how it is distributed over the population as well. And the story that Christine tells is, of course, a mixed one, a story of both great successes, which she elaborated on in the talk, and also major failures. And the success that I want to focus on is the one that she emphasized, the fiscal re-empowering of the state since the mid-1990s, when state revenue as a fraction of GDP sunk to amazingly low levels. You remember Christine's graph, down to about 10% in the mid 10% of GDP in the mid 1990s. Amazingly low, especially for a state that still calls itself socialist, which is, after all, a term that does imply that the state has a fairly large role, one way or another, in the economy. The reforms of the fiscal system since the mid-90s have brought government revenues back to a respectable level relative to GDP, 20% or a little more, and brought China back into the company of the rest of the world, actually, including even developing countries with lower per capita incomes than China. As Christine writes in one of her background papers for the talk, by far the most important reforms during the Hu-1 period, 2002 to 2012, were the massive expansion of government spending, the rebalancing towards social services, and the concerted effort at redistributing resources toward the rural, less developed regions. During this period, government spending grew nearly 8-fold, while GDP grew only 5-fold or a little more. And budgetary spending on education rose by some 27 times, on healthcare about 15 times. So as Christine writes, social spending outpaced government spending, which in turn outpaced GDP growth. These are quite momentous changes. And they were important in countering China's rapidly increasing inequality of wealth and incomes as well. And they gave millions of people a step up toward achieving higher levels of capabilities by being healthier and better educated and so on. So, I think we should recognize these major achievements for what they were. Unfortunately now, Christine also shows that these achievements are now threatened since about 2015 by a slowing of growth, by a reversal of revenue buoyancy, that is to say, revenues falling, rising less rapidly than economic growth rather than more rapidly, as during the Hu-1 period. The reluctance of the center to relieve localities of their unfunded mandates and the increasingly perilous nature of local finances. I have in my notes that an invitation to Christine to go in perhaps to more detail about the political economy, explaining this reversal. But I think she actually did a pretty good job to begin with. So I would not make that request, although anything she wants to say further is certainly welcome. Christine writes in one of the background papers, the social welfare system is still in its infancy, and its components are marred by fragmentation with incomplete and inadequate coverage that limits their capacity to provide a buffer against income loss and to boost consumption, close quote. I think most people who study China's social welfare system would agree with that judgment. And that, to me, suggests a question. We've become used to the lightning fast institutional change and development in China, from the rural decollectivization in the late 70s, early 80s, which seemed to happen overnight, to the later incredibly rapid urbanization, urban development ahead of demand, the building of urban infrastructure, even the subwayization, to coin a very ugly term, which you're not permitted to use, of cities. The last data I've seen on subways was for 2019, when already 33 cities in China had installed subway systems. Pretty damn impressive. Yet the social welfare system, in contrast, with the exception of that important period in the middle, the who won period, can still be described as still in its infancy, although it's been present for well over a decade. Unemployment insurance, in fact, came in the late 90s in response to the state enterprise reform. And so that's more than 2 decades old. So why have social welfare institutions evidently grown much slower in terms of their coverage and so on than other aspects of China's development, except temporarily during this middle period? Might be interesting for somebody to compare the rate at which our Social Security program, which was inaugurated in 1935, how that was implemented, and Medicare 30 years later in 1965, with China's implementation of its comparable programs, to see what kinds of similarities and differences occurred. And although the state has been quick to establish social welfare institutions like unemployment insurance and health insurance and Social Security, actual sufficiency and coverage have tended to lag behind establishment. What are the fundamental reasons for that problem? So that brings me to the third point, which is also a question. Looking especially at the narrow coverage issue, one part of that is, does China have the capacity to address people as individuals? I mean, for all kinds of relief spending, has China ever reached out to individual households other than with the Dibao program and its rural anti-poverty efforts, although even those until recently were focused on developing so-called poor counties rather than poor households, and thus depended on indirect aid to poor households. In the US, when means-tested relief programs are proposed, the idea is usually to rely on income tax information to assess needs as a proxy for need. I think fewer than 2% of Chinese now pay personal income tax. And the personal income tax, and Christine will correct me if I'm wrong, supplies only something like 7% of total government revenue. And those who do pay income tax, of course, are at the upper end of the income distribution, and therefore they're not the ones who are going to need the social welfare program, need relief. So personal income tax data are simply not available for informing direct payment types of relief. So unless there are other effective ways of assessing individual need as in a crisis, perhaps restoring employment by supporting investment in exports through supporting companies, businesses, reasonably seemed like the most effective way to reach a large number of households quickly. Premier Lee suggests in a quote from one of Christine's papers, quote, COVID-19, I'm sorry, that's the name of the paper. Quoting Lee, the stimulus program we have adopted this time devotes about 70% of the funds to relatively direct support to residents' income, because doing so can promote consumption and drive the market. But what does relatively direct mean? That term relatively is suspicious, isn't it? Bijal. It could mean restoring employment by bailing out employers. That's relatively direct, right? It's not direct, but it's relatively direct. For as Christine points out, direct intervention on jobs and income, quote, was not reflected in the government's budget. The fiscal stimulus measures, while wide-ranging, are almost entirely devoted to supporting businesses rather than individuals. There is neither a cash handout component nor an injection of funds to boost through social welfare programs. So I'm just, again, raising as a naive question that one reason may be the difficulty of assessing individual need because of lack of adequate data, which again might leave it the government concluding that indirect assistance via spending on businesses to restore employment was the fastest way to help households in need. And by the same token, that the relatively indirect policy of locking down more severely than anywhere else in the world to cut off the spread of COVID-19 would be taken to be the fastest way to help people whose livelihoods were affected by the pandemic. And it turned out to be true up to a point. Finally, final point, the role of DBAL. Christine argues, I think, quite correctly, that DBAL failed to respond to the COVID crisis of millions losing their jobs and incomes. And she points out that despite the spectacular economic recovery from the pandemic in the later months of 2020, the labor market did not spring back that quickly, leaving many in need of help, which they did not get. And she argues that this help, at least some of it, should have been provided by the DBAL, which was very unresponsive to it. I wonder, though, whether DBAL can ever be expected to respond to a severe crisis such as the pandemic. Its origin lies in the mass unemployment of the state enterprise reform years of the late 90s. Laid off workers then were either retired early if they were old and close to retirement, or given a stipend, a minimal stipend, to keep them going while they searched for work. And a fairly long period was allowed for that to happen, after which, if they still hadn't found a job, even though they were sincerely looking for one, they might qualify for this newly established program called Minimum Livelihood Guarantee, DBAL. Moreover, as Christine also points out, acceptance into the DBAL program required satisfying rather harsh conditions, including not having any assets at all. A bicycle or a cell phone could disqualify one. These are precisely the assets that should help people find a job. One's economic situation being posted publicly so everybody could see it and so on. Now, the intent may have been to justify to the public the payment of relief to an accepted individual from public funds, but also it surely had to have the effect of warding off some who needed relief but who did not want to accept the shame associated with receiving it. DBAL is, of course, the glaring exception to my earlier point about lacking information on individual incomes. DBAL acquires that information in painstaking, thorough, time-consuming, and humiliating detail. But it's difficult for just that reason to see Dibao abandoning that methodology and expanding into a temporary relief program whose numbers would flexibly wax and wane in response to either emergencies or COVID-19 type, either emergencies like COVID-19 or the business cycle, economic fluctuations. There is a temporary relief program. One of the graphs in Christine's presentation showed that that was the only program that of aid to individuals that actually grew, although not really enough to make a big difference. The unemployment insurance program surely should have grown faster. If I were at this point trying to choose a program that I would want to focus on trying to expand rapidly and reform so that it could expand rapidly by embracing migrant workers as well as full status workers, urban workers, I would point at the unemployment insurance program rather than at Dibao. So I'll stop there, but a wonderful paper. Very happy to have heard it.
Thank you so much, Carl. A lot of good questions and very thoughtful. I would invite Christine to respond, but also invite our participants to enter any questions you might have to the Q&A box. As noted, we will not record the Q&A portion of this program, so feel free to raise any questions. Thank you. Christine.
I will just respond very quickly to a few points in Carl's very thoughtful and very nice comments. First on unemployment insurance. I think, when I, this was the first research I've done on unemployment insurance. I was shocked that this is basically a broken program. It's a broken program that seems to, it doesn't serve the needs of the people who are insured because the benefit levels are set so low that it doesn't come anywhere near replacement level. So it doesn't help buffer the income loss, in any significant way for workers. And it fails as an automatic stabilizer, as a macroeconomic tool to prop up consumption during periods of high unemployment because it's so unresponsive. And if you remember the two lines, even if you just take the registered unemployment numbers, which is grossly underestimated, the proportion of people who received benefits is a fraction of the registered unemployed. You have, 11.5 million people registered as unemployed at the end of 2020 versus 2.7 million people receiving benefits. Why? And in fact, I showed that long-term graph, from 1999 on to show that this is a long-term, long-standing problem. It's not just that, during COVID, people couldn't get to the unemployment office to fill out the application, blah, blah, which you do have to do, actually, which holds down a number of beneficiaries. But this is a program that has not received attention from anybody who really cared, I think. And I remember working, when I was in the World Bank, I went to a small city in Sichuan with the IFC, the private sector arm of the World Bank, to look at their small SOEs. This was back in the late 1990s, early 2000s, where they thought local governments could offload some of their money-losing SOEs to help pay for their other needs, spending needs. And I realized, I learned then that the the head of the labor bureau in this small city was the most powerful person in the city, aside from the mayor, because he was the one sitting on a pot of money that he collected from the unemployment contributions, and he wasn't paying out anything, you know. And the low enrollment rates actually shows that the only people who are enrolled in the program are formal sector employees, you know, in big SOEs, in government public institutions, and so on. They're the ones who are least at risk of losing a job. And that partly explains why there are very few payouts. But it's a program they didn't pay attention to. You know, the people who were required to enroll just did it as a matter of fact. And the people who could benefit from unemployment insurance protection didn't enroll because they wouldn't qualify for benefits because these are migrant workers. These are people who work in small enterprises, you know, in mom and pop shops that come and go and, you know, have higher risk of unemployment, etc. So definitely this is a program that needs to be fixed to be more service oriented, you know, to actually play a useful role. So it needs to be just wiped out and recreated. But on the issue of covering migrant workers, this is not quite the right program because the most of the majority of migrant workers now are being employed in service sector. You know, so as services grow as a proportion of the urban economy, these tend to be very unstable, you know, gig economy work. And it's very difficult for unemployment programs in most countries to cover people like that because it's hard for them to make regular contributions to qualify for benefits unless the governments took over, you know, and made it just a social program rather than an insurance program, which it is at the moment. And so I think something between DBAO and unemployment needs to be created to cater to these people with unstable employment. So right person to look at this because, sorry, I think there's a problem with my sound. Can you hear me all right?
We can hear you, but I think Carl got disconnected.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, the on the issue of why I think Carl points out a very important niche or a missing piece in the social welfare program and institutions in China, and that is the lack of information on personal incomes. He's absolutely right. The government does not have it because so few people pay personal income tax, as he points out. But actually, there's another channel through which the government could have collected information on incomes and chose not to. And that is the Social Security contributions, pension contributions in particular, which are based on payroll data, right? And so through Social Security contribution, companies should be turning over their payroll information and therefore personal income information. But they chose not to do it, and the Labor Bureau, the Ministry of Human Resources and Social Security chose to allow them not to do it because they only pay on the basis of 社平工资, you know, average wage rather than actual wage. And therefore, you know, there's no information. And the government has not traditionally dealt with individuals. Carl is absolutely right to point that out, that they tend to deal with regions, you know, administrative units rather than individuals. And that's partly because of the insufficient staffing in government. You know, when I talk about how transfers go level by level down. So the central government only gives money to provinces. Provinces only give money to municipalities. That's because the administrative system in China is a pyramid with most employees at the bottom. The top is very small. Okay, I once, when I was with the World Bank, we went to the Ministry of Finance and asked them, how many people manage your transfer programs? Because you're turning over 70% of central revenues every year to local governments. How are you managing them? How many people manage them? And they scratched their head and they discussed among themselves, and they came back with the answer: 2 full-time equivalents, 2 persons, 2 full-time equivalent persons. Now, whenever I've said that, subsequently, people in the ministry have been very upset with me. They said, no, this is a misrepresentation because, we turn it over to the line ministries. So, we don't have to deal with the details. It's line ministries who have to do that. So we went to the Ministry of Education and asked them, how many people in the ministry handle transfers to compulsory education? Well, the entire Department of Compulsory Education had like 5 people in it because everybody wanted to work in higher education and international education and so on. And it's very low status to work in compulsory education. So, at every level, at every unit, you find understaffing in managing these big programs. To tell the story in another way, the Chinese budget has grown, 80-fold or however many fold in the last 30 years. The number of people working for the Ministry of Finance, the number of posts they have in the Ministry of Finance has not increased since 1998. After Zhirongji cut them in half, they have stayed basically constant. They've hired some contractors, they've borrowed people from the provinces, but essentially the Ministry of Finance is grossly understaffed to manage the programs that they are financing. Okay, so they have to do this in a very kind of rough way and by delegation. And then the issue of, why do you say that these programs are in infancy when they've been around since 1990s? Well, China has gone through a very compressed development. I think we often forget that. They've taken 100 years worth of development and pressed it into 40 years. And these institutions have grown very fast, in scale. And the brain is having trouble keeping up, in developing the mechanisms and the flexibility for handling many of these programs. And somebody has called this governance by project or program, right? So you create programs to meet a particular need. So Dibao came up to service SOE reform. Unemployment insurance was created for SOE reform. And once SOE reforms were done, they moved on to other problems. There are other fires in the economy that need putting out. And so, there has to be a time when they come back and do a consolidation of these programs and review.
Thank you so much, both Christine and Carl.